WA's daily newspaper recently suffered a drop in circulation and half-year profit. Now Kerry Stokes, its largest shareholder, has called for the paper's entire board to be dismissed. Mr Stokes has been raiding the shares of WA's newspaper since media ownership laws were relaxed over a year ago. He now owns 19.4% and has used it to force an extraordinary general meeting, saying in a statement, "We've been appalled at the lack of leadership at the board and the resulting performance of the company." The WA News chairman puts the 21% decline in profits down to an upgrade of equipment. Media mogul has rallied support from the state government after an early morning phone call.
The West Australian is the worst newspaper in Australia. I think the board has let down the public in Western Australia because the West no longer informs the public about what's happening.
A meeting is expected to be held before April. Kerry Stokes and fellow Channel 7 director Peter Gamble both want one board position each.
At the moment, the West is living on its reputation more than it's living on its delivery and its performance.
Kerry Stokes laid out his case at a sell-out breakfast in Perth this morning. He told 1,200 businessmen and women the West Australian was a newspaper in rapid decline.
The front page of the paper invariably is not a paper at which people want to pick up and pay money to read.
Brandishing a copy of the Sunday Times, Mr Stokes predicted that for the first time, the News Limited paper would outsell the Saturday edition of the West Australian.
And its customer is the reader, and the readers have stopped buying the newspaper.
The Seven network owns 20% of WA newspapers, worth $480 million, but Mr Stokes has been denied a seat on the newspaper's board. So he's seeking to have the present board members replaced, claiming they lack experience running a media company.
If you look at the performance of this company over many years, as a media company, it has outperformed other media companies, including Seven.
The board of the West Australian rejects all of Mr Stokes' criticisms, but what it most objects to is control of the newspaper falling to Mr Stokes without him having to pay for it.
This is all about a competitor trying to get into our boardroom, trying to take control of the company without paying a premium.
It's a curious strategy. The boss of our rival television network coming to Channel 9 to state his case for change. But such is Kerry Stokes' passion to spread his word against the West.
You own a Perth TV station,
yes,
and you're trying to own the only paper in town. How is this good for Perth viewers and Perth readers?
We see them as separate entities. We wouldn't control the West, and this is the big furphy.
Is this a case of sort of sentimentality over business, your heart really ruling your head?
No, the West has always been an important newspaper. West Australia's my home. I love Western Australia. I love everything about it. We're going through the most important period that we've ever been through. The West should be playing a bigger part and a bigger role in that progress than it has.
But you've been outspoken about the fact none of us want to read it anymore. So do you want to sit on the board, or do you actually want to be the editor?
No, certainly. I've never been the editor. I've been on lots of things. In fact, my job has always been putting together the right teams of people that run it without me.
You clearly don't believe that the team is working, so therefore you would have to sack the editor, wouldn't you?
No, not necessarily.
Do you think he's been a bit juvenile?
I can't judge the editor because until I see what how the board have interfered. Do I say it should be the Sunday Times? Of course not. But then again, 10 years ago, the Sunday Times was half the circulation of the West Australian. So somewhere along the line, they've been doing something consistently right.
What about your relationship? I've got to finish this. What about your relationship with the state government? You rang Jim McGuinty and the Premier before having a go on the board.
Yeah.
I mean, is that inappropriate?
No, I rang over 100 people that day, including the chairman of Fairfax, the chairman of News, federal members, people who would be affected by a change of the West Australian. I don't need any government support, but they're allowed to express their opinion like everybody else.
Just how much support Kerry Stokes has will be put to a shareholders vote at the Hyatt tomorrow. The West Australian newspaper board was asked to comment for this story and couldn't find the time.
Kerry Stokes has won his battle to become chairman of West Australian Newspapers, and the billionaire owner of the Seven Network will have his local Channel 7 boss, Chris Wharton, joining him at the West as a new chief executive officer. Mr Stokes, who waged a public battle against previous board members, said any changes at the paper wouldn't come until the new CEO settled into his role.
Less than a year after merging his media assets with the Caterpillar equipment franchise, Kerry Stokes is shuffling the deck again. His latest restructure will see the West Australian newspaper join forces with the Seven Media Group.
This is a really big opportunity for West Australian newspapers. We're delighted that the independent board have unanimously recommended this proposal.
You know, we've got a whole group of assets which just moved sideways. What has happened is the valuations have changed radically.
When West Australian Newspapers was run by an independent management team, they looked at deals like this every year, and they could never make the numbers work.
West Australian Newspapers, which is a quarter owned by Seven Group Holdings, will buy Seven Media Group for $4.1 billion by issuing shares and convertible notes, repaying a loan and taking on $2 billion of debt. As chairman and biggest individual shareholder of both Seven and WAN, Kerry Stokes won't be able to vote on the proposal. Independent director Doug Flynn has led negotiations for West Australian newspapers and says his team has struck a good deal for shareholders.
And I think this massively changes the opportunity for the company over the coming years. It secures WAN's future and it creates a new growth path for us.
A new holding company, Seven West Media, will house the newspaper, television, magazine and internet businesses. Seven Group Holdings, which is 2/3 owned by Kerry Stokes, will keep a quarter stake in Consolidated Media, which has an interest in Foxtel, along with Westrac, which holds the Caterpillar equipment franchise.
That's where the growth is, and you know, I know where I'd want to be for the next 3-4 years in the boom. I'd stay upstairs in the Westrac listed entity.
If I was a West Australian newspaper shareholder, I'd be very concerned at the huge increase in debt load that's been taken with this transaction. And I'd also be worried about what's 2012 going to bring.
It's a very much expanded company. It has diversification that didn't exist before.
While analysts agree the deal is good for WAN's major shareholder, Seven Group Holdings, some estimate it could dilute the interests of WAN's minority investors by more than $600 million, or 1/6 of the $4 billion group. WAN's share price tumbled 14% on Wednesday when it resumed trading, and the proposed deal sparked a raft of earnings downgrades and sell recommendations.
Those shareholders have had a bad ride. You know, it peaked out in 2007 at $16 plus a share, and there's essentially a dilution occurring for incoming institution to make the deal work at $5.20. That's a pretty big reduction in the West Australian newspaper's shareholding position.
We've acquired Seven Media Group for $4.1 billion, and the independent expert assessed it at between $4.6 billion and $5.1 billion. So I think we've cut a pretty good deal for our shareholders.
Mike Mangan from 2MG Asset Management says this deal is straight from the Kerry Stokes playbook, wresting control of a company without having to pay a takeover premium.
Again, there's a track record here that goes back over 15 years, at least, of Mr Stokes buying and selling assets into and out of companies in which he controls. And the funny thing is, he always comes out on top.
Despite that history, Doug Flynn says there's strong institutional support for the deal, with 90% participating in this week's first stage of $1 billion capital raising. And he argues WAN's share price fall over recent years is largely due to factors outside the control of management or the company's directors.
West Australian Newspapers has the highest margin of any newspaper in this country, and to my knowledge, it's got the second highest margin of any newspaper on the planet. But the fact of the matter is that newspapers have been marked down simply because their future is in serious question.
It's a different story, though, for Seven's television business. Last February, when the Westrac merger was proposed, Seven Media Group was forecasting earnings of around $300 million for this financial year. In the documents released this week, that forecast has been raised by half to $450 million. And the big jump in Seven's earnings has raised questions as to why that wasn't flagged sooner with a profit upgrade.
I mean, we're only 9 months since the WestTrac deal, and I calculated at the time, I had no problem with that deal. It was the pricing of the deal that I had a problem with. I calculated that delivered about $200 million of additional value to Mr Stokes relative to what he should have got.
We can't ignore the fact that there was a GFC and there's been a fundamental change in the nature of their business with the advent of the digital multi-channels. So we can be as cynical as we like, but at the end of the day, facts might get in the way of that.
Kerry Stokes' main concern now is to convince a majority of investors to vote for the transaction in April. While it may be a bitter pill for long-term WAN investors sitting on big paper losses, Kerry Stokes is a proven deal maker, and he may have already mustered enough support at the top end of town to get this one over the line.
For Kerry Stokes, it's a marriage of two great loves.
My love of Seven Network and of West Australian newspapers is indeed more than an everyday share price.
Today, shareholders, including mum and dad investors, came to approve the nuptials. Most saw a happy future.
WA News can't stand alone anymore.
Newspapers have done well over the years, and I don't think they need this.
If they didn't move ahead and go into the digital age, they'd die.
A lot of shareholders are very disappointed the way the share price has dropped and concerned for future dividends.
I think it's inevitable. They've got to join the digital age.
A number of shareholders needed convincing that saddling their profitable company with $2 billion in debt was worth it. But in the end, a clear majority voted in favour of the deal.
Shareholders were promised healthy dividends would continue, and paying down debt was a priority.
We unanimously recommend that WAN shareholders vote in favour.
The vote, almost 60 to 80% in favour of 5 takeover motions.
Julia Gillard would give a right arm for that sort of majority.
So what does it mean? The creation of Seven West, Australia's biggest media company, and changes to 2 WA institutions.
We will stay stronger, longer, and have an opportunity to go into new areas.
And for Seven, somewhere new to call home, ending Perth Commercial Television's 50-year link with the same suburb.
Television stations at Chewett Hill within the next 3 years will be a thing of the past.
Moving in with its new partner at Herdsman, or a central city pad.
It's been 7 years since the Perth Entertainment Centre last closed its doors. Since then, there's been a lot of talk and speculation. But today, confirmation that, if all goes to plan, the old centre will be demolished and replaced with new development by 2012. This is what the new development could look like, including 500 apartments, shops, offices and possibly a new home for Channel 7 in the city.